The wind was a thief. It stole the warmth from Alara's bones, the breath from her lungs, and the last vestiges of hope from the parched, gray land. It howled around the corners of the small cabin, a mournful chorus to the silence that had become her only companion since Jacob's grave was new. The cross she had fashioned from 2 pieces of river birch was already bleached pale by the relentless sun, a stark white bone jutting from the hard-packed earth. Autumn had come to the territory with a vengeance, stripping the aspens on the far ridge to shivering, skeletal fingers that clawed at a sky the color of slate. The world was shrinking, closing in, and she was at its desolate center. Today, the sky was bruised purple and black at the edges, a storm gathering its fury in the mountains. Alara secured the last of the shutters, her knuckles raw and red from the cold. The air tasted of iron and ozone, a metallic tang that promised violence. Inside, the cabin was a small pocket of defiance against the vast emptiness. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, its light dancing over the rough-hewn timbers and the few meager possessions that marked her life. A worn Bible, a tin cup, Jacob's hat still hanging from a peg by the door. She ran a hand over its felt brim, the gesture automatic, a phantom touch for a phantom man. The grief was no longer a sharp, piercing cry but a dull, constant ache in her chest, a weight that made every task, every breath, an effort of will. The rain began as a whisper, a tentative patter on the roof, but soon grew to a furious roar. It was a deluge, a skyborn river intent on washing the world clean. Alara watched through a crack in the shutter as the dry creek bed behind the cabin began to fill, first with a trickle, then a muddy surge. Within the hour, it was a churning, brown torrent, thick with uprooted saplings and debris. It was the kind of storm that remade landscapes, that erased boundaries and exposed the raw, unforgiving bones of the earth. It was a reflection of the tempest inside her own heart. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach. The cabin was sturdy. Jacob had built it to last, but the sheer force of the water was terrifying. It clawed at the banks, eating away the soil where her small vegetable garden had withered. It was then that she saw it, a shape, dark and struggling, tossed in the maelstrom. At first, she thought it was a log, or perhaps a deer caught in the flash flood. But then an arm breached the surface, flailing, reaching for a hold that wasn't there. It was a person, a man. He was being swept downstream, his head disappearing beneath the churning water only to reappear moments later, further away. A cold dread, sharper than her grief, seized her. The settlement was a full day's ride away. There was no one else, no one to help, no one to call. There was only her. Panic and instinct warred within her. To go out in that storm was madness. The bank was slick mud, the current a ravenous beast. Yet, to stay inside, to watch a man drown before her very eyes, was a different kind of damnation. She thought of Jacob, his life cut short by a fever that had burned through him like a wildfire. She had been helpless then. She would not be helpless now. Grabbing the heavy coil of rope from beside the door, she unbolted it and plunged into the screaming wind and rain. The water was a physical blow, soaking her thin dress in an instant, chilling her to the marrow. The mud sucked at her boots, threatening to pull her down. She scrambled along the collapsing bank, her eyes fixed on the man. He was closer now, snagged for a moment on the submerged branches of a fallen cottonwood. He was native, his long black hair plastered to his face, his skin the color of wet copper. The people in the settlement spoke of the Apache with fear and hatred, calling them savages, ghosts of the wilderness. But in that moment, all Alara saw was a human being fighting for his life. "Here!" she screamed, her voice snatched away by the wind. "Catch it!" She swung the rope, her arm aching with the effort. The first throw fell short, consumed by the current. The second was wider, falling just beyond his reach. He was weakening, his movements becoming more sluggish. She gathered the rope again, her hands numb, her lungs burning. She put all her strength, all her desperation, into the third cast. The loop sailed through the rain-streaked air and landed over his shoulder. He fumbled for it, his fingers slipping, But finally, he got a hold. The pull was immense. The current fought her, trying to claim them both. She dug her heels into the mud, wrapping the rope around her waist, her body screaming in protest. Inch by agonizing inch, she dragged him from the main current toward the relative calm of the bank. He was a dead weight, barely conscious. When his feet finally found purchase in the shallows, he collapsed, half in and half out of the water. Alara hauled him the rest of the way, her muscles trembling with exhaustion. He lay on the muddy ground, his chest rising and falling in shallow, ragged breaths. His face was bruised, a long gash bleeding freely on his temple. He was younger than she first thought, perhaps her own age, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw, features that even in their battered state held a kind of severe beauty. Getting him to the cabin was an ordeal. He was heavy, a dead weight of muscle and bone. She half-dragged, half-carried him, stumbling through the mud, the rain relentless. Inside, she barred the door against the storm and eased him onto the rag rug before the fire. She stripped off his soaked leather tunic and leggings, her movements practical, devoid of modesty. This was about survival, nothing more. His body was lean and corded with muscle, crisscrossed with old scars that told stories she could not read. She cleaned the gash on his head with whiskey and a clean rag, hissing in sympathy as he flinched, a low groan escaping his lips. She covered him with her thickest wool blanket and sat back on her heels, shivering, her own clothes dripping a puddle onto the floorboards. He remained unconscious for hours. The storm raged outside, and the fire crackled within. The two sounds a strange duet of chaos and peace. Alara changed into dry clothes and sat in her rocking chair, watching him. She had saved an Apache warrior. The thought was a disquieting one. If Silas from the settlement knew, he would call her a traitor. They would say she had brought the wolf to her own door. But looking at the vulnerable figure by her fire, all she felt was a profound and weary sense of shared humanity. He was just a man caught in a storm, same as her. He woke near dawn. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and eerily silent. His eyes opened, dark and fathomless, and fixed on her. There was no fear in them, only a still, assessing quality that made her feel transparent. He did not speak. He simply watched her as she moved about the cabin, stoking the fire, making coffee. She offered him a cup, and he took it, his long fingers wrapping around the warm tin. He drank it slowly, his gaze never leaving her face. She offered him a piece of dry bread, which he also accepted. When he was finished, he stood. He was taller than she'd realized, his presence filling the small room. He moved with a liquid grace, despite his injuries. He walked to the door, picked up his wet clothes, and turned back to her. For a long moment, their eyes met. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was not thanks, not precisely. It was an acknowledgement, a marking of a debt. Then he was gone, melting back into the damp, gray wilderness from which he had come. Alara stood at the open door, watching the empty space where he had been. A strange feeling settling in her heart. She had done a good and dangerous thing, and she did not know if it was an ending or a beginning. The days that followed were steeped in an unnerving quiet. The world seemed to be holding its breath. The initial relief Alara felt at her solitude's return was soon replaced by a prickling unease. It began as a flicker in her peripheral vision, a sense of being observed as she chopped wood or carried water from the well. She would spin around, her heart hammering against her ribs, only to see the empty sweep of the plains and the stoic, silent rise of the ridge. She told herself it was her nerves, the lingering echo of the storm and the stranger. Jacob had always said the loneliness could play tricks on a person's mind out here, making them see ghosts in the heat shimmer and hear voices in the wind. But this was no ghost. A week after the storm, she saw him clearly. He was standing on the crest of the ridge, a silhouette against the pale morning sky. He was as still as the ancient rocks around him, a part of the landscape itself. He was simply watching, not menacingly, not with any overt intent she could decipher, but with a focused, unwavering stillness that felt more invasive than any threat. Her breath caught in her throat. He was too far to make out his features, but she knew it was him. The set of his shoulders, the way he held himself. It was the man from the river. Her fear returned, sharp and cold. Why was he there? Was he waiting for an opportunity to attack, to repay her kindness with violence as the stories always warned? Was he watching to see if she would betray him, to see if she would ride to the settlement and tell them an Apache was lurking nearby? She spent the day in a state of high alert. The heavy rifle Jacob had taught her to use leaning against the wall by the door, its cold metal a small, inadequate comfort. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of the wind in the dry grasses sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. She felt exposed, a solitary creature laid bare under the gaze of a predator. Yet, as the sun arced across the sky, he did not move from his post. He was a silent sentinel, a feature of her new reality. When dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the horizon, he was gone. The ridge was empty once more, but his absence was now as palpable as his presence had been. The next day he was there again, and the day after that. A routine began to establish itself. She would rise and he would be there. She would work and he would watch. She would retreat into her cabin at night, and in the morning the vigil would resume. The fear did not vanish, but it began to change, to transmute into something more complex. It was a wearying thing to be afraid all the time. Slowly, a strange and unwelcome curiosity crept in. His watch was patient, relentless, but it was also passive. He made no move to approach, no gesture of aggression. There was a discipline in his stillness that she began, grudgingly, to respect. He was not lurking in the shadows. He stood in plain sight, as if announcing his presence was part of his purpose. Then the small offerings began. She had spent a full day trying to split a stubborn, gnarled log for firewood, her axe glancing off the dense wood time and again until her arms burned and her spirit frayed. She had abandoned it in frustration, leaving the axe embedded in the mocking log. The next morning, when she stepped outside into the crisp air, she found a neat stack of perfectly split firewood beside her door, enough to last a week. The stubborn log was gone, replaced by its tidy, vanquished pieces. Her heart leaped into her throat. She scanned the ridge. He was there in his usual spot, a motionless silhouette. There was no one else for miles. Could only have been him. A few days later, her traps, which had been distressingly empty as winter's chill deepened, yielded a surprise. Lying on her porch was a plump rabbit, already skinned and cleaned, ready for the pot. It was a gift of sustenance, left as silently and mysteriously as the firewood. She stood on the porch for a long time, the cold seeping into her bare feet, staring at the offering. This was not the behavior of a savage waiting to strike. This was something else entirely, something for which she had no name. It was a silent conversation, a language of deeds instead of words. She wrestled with it, her mind a turmoil of ingrained prejudice and present reality. The men at the settlement would laugh, or worse, accuse her of consorting with the enemy. They saw only a threat, a faceless savage. But the man on the ridge was providing for her, protecting her in some unspoken way. His silent presence, once a source of terror, was slowly becoming a strange sort of comfort. He was a constant in a world where she had lost every other anchor. He was the one person who knew she was here, who saw her struggle, even if he saw it from a distance. One evening, emboldened by a strange mix of gratitude and defiance, she acted. She had made a thick, hearty stew from the rabbit he had left, the aroma filling the small cabin with a sense of warmth and life it had lacked for months. Before she ate, she ladled a generous portion into a spare bowl. With her heart pounding, she opened the door and placed the bowl on the porch railing, the steam rising from it like a prayer into the twilight air. She retreated inside, not daring to watch from the window, feeling as though to observe the act would be to break the delicate, unspoken rules of their arrangement. She ate her own dinner in silence, the quiet of the cabin feeling different tonight, charged, expectant. She did not know if he would take it. The offering might be an insult. It might be ignored. She lay in her bed for hours, listening. Just before she drifted off to sleep, she heard the faintest sound, a soft scraping of the bowl on the wooden rail. In the morning, she opened the door with a trembling hand. The bowl was there, sitting on the railing, empty and wiped clean. And nestled inside it were 3 small, wild onions, their purple skins translucent in the morning light. Alara picked them up, their earthy scent sharp and clean. A tear, hot and unexpected, traced a path down her cheek. It was not a tear of sadness or of fear, but of a profound and startling connection. A debt had been acknowledged. A gift had been returned. On the ridge, the silent figure stood, watching as the sun rose, and for the first time, Alara did not feel fear. She felt seen. The first snows came early that year, a fine, dusting powder that turned to a thick, suffocating blanket overnight. The world was rendered in stark black and white, the pines heavy with white cloaks, the vast plains a sea of unbroken snow. The beauty of it was sharp and dangerous. Winter was not a season of rest here. It was a battle for survival. The man on the ridge remained, his dark form a stark contrast against the snow. He had moved closer, taking up a new position at the edge of the treeline that bordered her property, a more intimate and watchful proximity. The silent exchange of goods continued. A brace of grouse for a loaf of her dense, dark bread. A bundle of medicinal herbs for a jar of dried beans. They were weaving a fragile tapestry of interdependence, thread by silent thread. It was this newfound, delicate peace that was shattered by the arrival of Silas and Jed. They rode up to her cabin unannounced, their horses trampling the pristine snow, their voices loud and grating in the immense quiet. Silas was a big man, running to fat, with a wheezing laugh and small, greedy eyes that took in everything. The sturdy cabin, the wisp of smoke from her chimney, and her, a lone woman with a calculating hunger. Jed was his shadow, a gaunt, twitchy man with a stained beard and a perpetual sneer. They were prospectors, they claimed, but Alara knew their type. They prospected for weakness, for opportunities to take what was not theirs. "Well now, Mrs. Gable," Silas boomed, dismounting with a grunt. "A widow woman, all alone out here. It ain't right. It ain't safe." He surveyed her small homestead as if he were already measuring it for a deed. "I'm managing, Mr. Croft," Alara said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She did not invite them in. She stood on her porch, the cold air a barrier between them. Their initial visits were cloaked in a syrupy, false concern. They offered to buy her out, a pittance for the land Jacob had poured his sweat and blood into. "A woman's got no business trying to run a place like this," Jed sneered, spitting a stream of tobacco juice that stained the snow a filthy brown. "You should be in town where you belong." Alara's refusal was polite but firm. This land was all she had left of her husband, of their shared dream. To sell it would be the final betrayal. Her defiance hardened their demeanor. The mask of civility slipped, revealing the ugliness beneath. They began a campaign of petty cruelties, designed to wear her down, to make her feel the full weight of her vulnerability. One morning she found the gate to her small corral thrown open, her 2 goats wandering and frightened. Another time, the rope to her well was cut, forcing her to spend hours painstakingly splicing it back together in the freezing cold. They were a tangible threat, a vocal, swaggering cruelty that stood in stark contrast to the silent, watchful presence at the edge of her woods. And he saw it all. Whenever Silas and Jed were there, his dark form would be visible, a disquieting statue among the trees. He made no move, but his presence was a palpable weight, a third party in their conflict. "What's with that red-skinned skulker?" Silas had asked one day, gesturing with his chin toward the treeline. "You keeping pets now, widow?" "He's just passing through," Alara had lied, her heart pounding. "Best he keeps passing," Jed muttered, his hand resting on the butt of the pistol at his hip. Don't like being watched, but they were unnerved. His silent, unblinking gaze was something they couldn't bully, couldn't intimidate. It was an unknown quantity, and it made them nervous. The tension escalated as the winter deepened. The men grew more brazen, their visits more frequent, their threats more explicit. They spoke of what happened to stubborn women, their words heavy with insinuation. Alara took to barring her door even during the day, the rifle never far from her hand. The sense of safety she had begun to feel was gone, replaced by a gnawing, constant dread. Her silent guardian at the edge of the woods was a comfort, but he was one man, and they were two, armed and emboldened by their own cruelty. She felt trapped, a pawn in a game she could not win. The breaking point came during a blizzard. The storm descended without warning, a swirling vortex of white that erased the world. The wind shrieked like a banshee, piling drifts of snow against the cabin walls. It was the kind of storm that trapped man and beast, that froze the very marrow in your bones. And it was in the heart of this storm that they came. She heard them first, their drunken shouts barely audible over the howl of the wind. A heavy thud against the door made her jump, her blood running cold. "Open up, widow." Silas's voice was a muffled roar. "We've come to keep you warm." A cruel laugh followed. Panic seized her. She scrambled to push the heavy oak table against the door, her breath coming in ragged sobs. The wood groaned as a heavy weight slammed against it again. They were trying to break it down. She was trapped. There was nowhere to run, no one to call for. The wild, swirling snow was a white prison, and the wolves were at the door. She grabbed the rifle, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold it steady. She had shot deer with Jacob, but she had never pointed a gun at a man. The door splintered, a crack appearing near the latch. A blast of icy wind and snow shot into the room. "Just a little more, Jed," Silas grunted from outside. Tears streamed down Alara's face. This was it. This was the end Jacob had always feared for her. Alone and at the mercy of brutal men. Just as a large section of the door caved in, revealing a sliver of the raging storm and Silas's leering face, a shadow detached itself from the blizzard. It was him. He moved not like a man, but like a part of the storm itself, a silent, swift embodiment of winter's fury. There was no war cry, no shout. One moment, Silas was peering through the hole in the door, and the next, he was gone, pulled back into the white chaos with a choked cry. Jed, caught by surprise, turned, raising his pistol. But he was too slow. A shape, dark and fluid, was on him. There was a dull thud, a muffled grunt, and then only the sound of the wind. It was over in seconds. A brutal, silent, and terrifyingly efficient ballet of violence. Alara stood frozen, the rifle still clutched in her hands, staring at the broken door. The wind howled through the opening, but the menacing voices were gone. After a long moment, a figure stepped through the ruined doorway, shaking the snow from his shoulders. It was the man from the river. His face was grim, a fresh cut bleeding on his cheek, but his eyes, when they met hers, were calm. He looked at the rifle in her hands, then back at her, and gave a slow, deliberate nod before turning his attention to the shattered door, as if the violence of a moment ago was already a thing of the past, and all that mattered now was the practical task of shutting out the cold. The blizzard raged for 2 more days, sealing them inside the small cabin. The wind's scream was a constant accompaniment to the charged silence between them. He had wedged the broken pieces of the door back into place and braced it with the heavy table, a temporary fix against the storm's fury. The bodies of Silas and Jed were gone, vanished into the white tempest as if they had never been. He had dealt with them, and Alara did not ask how. The brutal finality of it was something she locked away, a dark and necessary secret they now shared. He had a deep gash on his forearm from Jed's flailing knife. After he had secured the door, Alara had taken his arm, her touch hesitant. He did not pull away. She cleaned the wound with whiskey, just as she had done by the river, her movements sure and steady now. She wrapped it with a strip of clean linen, her fingers brushing against his skin. It was the most contact they had ever had, a small point of warmth and care in the frozen world. He watched her, his dark eyes unreadable, but she thought she saw a flicker of something in their depths. Not surprise, but a quiet acceptance. They existed in the small space, a world reduced to the crackling fire, the howling wind, and their shared presence. He sat on the floor by the hearth, tending the fire, his stillness a calming anchor in the storm. She sat in her rocking chair, mending a tear in his tunic, the simple, domestic act a strange counterpoint to the violence that had brought them here. The silence was different now. It was not the empty, lonely silence of her grief, nor the tense, uncertain silence of his distant watch. It was a comfortable, shared quiet, full of unspoken understanding. He had saved her life, and in doing so had irrevocably bound his to hers. On the third morning they woke to a world transformed. The wind had died, and an absolute, profound silence had fallen. Alara opened the door to a landscape of breathtaking, brutal beauty. The snow was piled in immense, sculpted drifts, glittering under a sky of the palest, clearest blue. The air was so cold it felt sharp in her lungs, a clean, purifying pain. It was a new world, washed clean of the ugliness of the past days. He came to stand beside her in the doorway, and together they looked out at the dawn. The old distance between them, the ridge, the treeline, had been erased. He was here by her side. "They will not return," he said. His voice was low and rough, as if from disuse, but it was clear. It was the first time he had spoken to her, the first words to cross the chasm of silence. The sound of it was startling, yet deeply familiar, as if she had been waiting to hear it all along. "I know," she replied, her own voice barely a whisper. There was nothing more that needed to be said. In those few words everything was acknowledged. The threat, the rescue, the debt that was now paid in full, the bond that remained. He spent the day helping her. He did not retreat to the woods. With a quiet, focused energy, he began the work of repairing the damage. He used Jacob's tools with a practiced ease, his hands deft and sure as he crafted a new, stronger latch for the door. Alara worked alongside him, clearing a path through the snow to the well, tending to her goats, who had weathered the storm in their small, sturdy shed. They moved around each other with an unspoken rhythm, a partnership that needed no direction. She learned his name that afternoon. She had been heating broth over the fire and turned to offer him some. She hesitated, not knowing what to call him. He seemed to sense her question before she asked it. "Kenai," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "Alara," she answered, a small smile touching her lips for the first time in what felt like an eternity. Felt like a true introduction, a beginning. The sun began to set, painting the snow in hues of rose and gold. Kenai had finished mending the door, its new planks solid and secure. He stood and looked out at the vast, darkening landscape. For a moment, Alara felt a pang of fear that he would leave, that he would melt back into the wilderness now that his purpose was served. But he turned back from the door, his gaze settling on her. He picked up the axe from beside the hearth. "The wood is low," he stated simply, and headed out toward the woodpile. Alara watched him go, her heart swelling with a feeling so potent it almost brought her to her knees. It was not love, not yet, but it was a profound and powerful hope. The sharp edges of her grief for Jacob had not disappeared, but they had been softened, rounded by the presence of this silent, steadfast man. She was no longer just a widow, a survivor clinging to the remnants of a life. She was a woman who had faced down the worst of the wilderness and the worst of men and had not been broken. She had found a strength she never knew she possessed, and she had found an ally in the most unlikely of places. The world outside was still harsh and unforgiving. The winter would be long, the challenges many. But as she watched Kenai's strong, steady form splitting wood against the backdrop of the brilliant, snowy twilight, she knew she was no longer alone. The sound of his axe echoed in the crisp, clear air, a steady, rhythmic heartbeat in the vast silence. It was the sound of a new life beginning.